Welcome back to the Deep Cover Podcast. We are right in the midst of the March Madness craziness season, and everybody's locked in watching college basketball. And I had some thoughts here about what college basketball has become and where it's going, the overall state of college sports, right? So, March Madness largely has become a 3 week sport, right? Or college basketball, I should say, has become a 3 week sport. We lock in to maybe the conference tournaments in the beginning of March, but then we're really into it in the tournament time, right? We're really into it when it's brackets and pools and stuff. And why is that? I think there's a few factors. The first is the calendar, right? The timeline for March Madness is a lot more advantageous than the regular season of college basketball, right? So you're having a situation where, think about this, the middle of March to the beginning of April. What do you really have going on? You're at the end of the NBA and NHL season, so they're kind of fighting for playoff position, but most people are they're kind of monitoring it until the playoffs actually arrive. Baseball hasn't started yet; it starts at the beginning of April. The NFL, the draft isn't until the end of April, and free agency has already passed, so it's kind of a little bit of a lull for the NFL. And so you're kind of in a situation where the timing is perfect for one sport event to kind of dominate the entire landscape. And that's exactly what we have with March Madness. The next thing is the David versus Goliath aspect, right? So the weekend that we just saw a team like Oakland University, a small school in suburban Metro Detroit, beat Kentucky, a blue blood, and that's exciting, right? Being able to see a bunch of people you've never heard of before, kind of go in and shock the world against a team that was heavily favored and a team that more people are recognized with, right? So that kind of creates the magic. Then there's the bracket aspect. We all love filling out brackets. We all love getting into pools. We've kind of learned in recent years or recent months that we're very much a pro gambling society, right? With the infiltration of sports betting apps. So doing a bracket pool, it's incredibly appealing for people to really just want to dive in to kind of wagering and stuff like that, right? But you could also say that the regular season of college basketball has been incredibly devalued. And I think a big reason for that is a couple of factors in the overall landscape of college sports, where name, image, and likeness is prevalent. Transfer portal has become prevalent, and on their face, both of these things empower players, enable player mobility. They enable a player to get paid, for being in the national spotlight. And I'm never going to be a person who's against a player getting paid, because if they are noteworthy enough and bring the school enough revenue, hell yeah, they should be paid. Why not, right? The school's making millions upon millions of dollars on the backs of these athletes, especially in football and basketball. Why wouldn't you cash in on that to some degree to get a little bit of yours before you go into a professional league, right? And then with transfer portal, players can move around at will. But kind of the unforeseen consequence of this is that it really diminishes the brand identity of a lot of schools. Where you get a one and done player or a transfer portal player, and they are kind of trying to find their way through the regular season, and then hopefully they kind of put it all together in the tournament. And then a lot of times, if they're any good, they'll be leaving the school at the end of the year to go to the draft, or if it doesn't go well, they'll transfer out to another school. So it becomes a lack of continuity when it comes to March Madness and when it comes to the college basketball landscape. And it kind of feels a little bit like the sport has become a bit too reliant on March, right? I remember, years ago when I was getting into sports and getting into college basketball, I was growing up in New York City, so obviously the Big East was a big thing. St. John's was a big thing for me. And, I would look forward to conference games all the time and in the regular season. And then we would get into the conference tournament. And then eventually, obviously, the big tournament with March Madness. And I just kind of feel like a lot of that regular season intrigue is gone because of that lack of continuity with programs. And I'm not entirely sure what the fix is, but I think one thing that we could potentially look at is the regular season having a little bit more meaning for these teams that win the conference regular season but lose in the conference tournament. And you kind of have to wonder, well, how do we kind of balance that, right? Because you're in a situation where you're going to be making money and sponsorships off of these conference tournaments, but what's going to happen to make the regular season tournament more viable? Does a regular season champion get a little bit more of consideration at certain conferences? And it becomes a very slippery slope. On top of that, you're kind of at the whim of what the football programs are doing, right? A lot of this conference realignment stuff that's been going on, where teams switching conferences like wildfire and kind of creating these super conferences with the Big Ten and the SEC, have ripple effects into basketball. And now you kind of have these weird conferences that have a lot of schools that maybe aren't so good in basketball, but they're good in football, right? And I just kind of wonder if we're kind of heading towards a separation in between what football does and what everybody else does. And it's a fascinating time because basketball has become so heavy in March, but the rest of the time it's just kind of almost like a forgotten child during the regular season, where a lot of people would much rather tune into an NBA game, tune into an NHL game, whatever the case may be. And there's not a lot of intrigue for casual observers, as opposed to what we see in March, where everybody wants in. Obviously, in March, you have the sense of urgency, you have the upset potential, you have all this stuff that kind of matters. And you start to wonder, can March sustain this sport by itself? Are we always going to be gravitating towards the power of March Madness? In this week's conversation, I talked to Francis Carlota, a good friend of mine who covers the Memphis Grizzlies of the NBA and the Memphis Tigers in college basketball for Bluff City Media. And Francis is somebody who I've worked with before, and he has a lot of great opinions on college sports, the state of it, and all that. And in our conversation, we touch on a lot of stuff. Why March Madness is so impactful? What does the regular season look like moving forward? How does NIL, transfer portal, conference realignment, how does that all change? How are big brands in college affected by all of these changes in college sports? And I also wonder, and we mentioned this in our conversation with Francis, does a super conference where NBA, NFL, other professional league teams license the team identity, but also are funneling the finances for it, make more sense? Does it make more sense for the Milwaukee Bucks, instead of having the Wisconsin Herd like they do in the G League, to just license out the Wisconsin Badgers? Does it make more sense for the Houston Rockets to license out the Houston Cougars, right? And you use that, you give the money to the school for that, but you're effectively bringing it in as a more of a professional aspect, which is what a lot of these programs have become. The student athlete concept is kind of eroded a bit, and I think at big schools especially, and it's really all about competing for championships and winning, and that's always going to be the professional motif, right? So these are a few things that we touch on with Francis. So join us after the break on the Deep Cover podcast. I'll be talking to Francis Carlota of Bluff City Media to talk about the state of college basketball and the state of college athletics in 2024. All right, joining me now on the Deep Cover podcast is a voice of college basketball to help me out to navigate the sport that I don't follow that much. And so it's my guy, Francis Carlota from Bluff City Media. Here he covers the Memphis Tigers, a pretty good basketball program that unfortunately did not make the tournament this year. But yeah. Francis, thank you for joining me. Sorry to remind you of that, but But Bruce Pearl lost, so you're sitting good. How are you doing today, my man?
I'm well. It's I expect that any podcast that I do from the end of the NCAA basketball season up until really the start of next season, the intro will somehow include and the Tigers, and they lost, and they didn't make the NCAA tournament, yada yada yada. So I think I'm just going to have to get used to it at this point. And before we get into everything, I do want to apologize. I have congestion because it's allergy season, and it is the worst time of the year for this guy because my nose just starts
going crazy,
just snotty and coughing. So if I cough during the stream or sniffle a little bit, I apologize. I know it doesn't sound great for the sound nerds out there, but it's allergy season. What can I tell you? What can I tell you? But it's great to be here, Omar. Thank you so much.
Hey, no worries. Francis playing through injuries, man. That's all you could really ask for. So
yeah.
But today, I kind of want to, the tournament's going on. Obviously, we queued up with the fact that you cover college basketball with Memphis. And, I was kind of thinking about this lately. And I used to be like when I was younger, and so I was growing up in New York City. I got into St. John's, and was watching the heyday of the Big East. And it was a sport that kind of captivated you season round into the conference tournament, into the big dance. And now it feels like even the conference tournaments aren't that much of a big deal for like the casual observer. Like the diehards are still in it and watching regular season games. But do you kind of feel like college basketball over these past few years now has kind of just really become a 3-week sport where all people care about is the tournament?
So in terms of, I've thought about, first of all, I've thought about the questions that we're going to be talking about very deeply. So from my perspective of your first question, in terms of people caring about only the NCAA tournament, I do think that is the case in terms of fandom, in terms of the lay sports fan who may follow some team, but may not be a diehard for a certain program or a certain conference or whatever. For the lay casual sports fan that still loves March Madness, yes, it's because they love March Madness. They love the NCAA tournament. And for them, I have a lot of friends who are big sports fans who say to me, Francis, I haven't watched a lick of college basketball, but then the calendar turns March and all of a sudden I'm back. Like I'm locked in. I'm looking at who's a Cinderella, who's going to make upsets, who are the favorites. I'm also looking at players. The draft's going to be coming up in the summer. So now I'm going to look at prospects and things like that. And for a lot of people base draft prospect performance based on how they do in the tournament as well. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a whole different discussion. But either way, I do think for popularity's sake that, yes, it has become a focus on the NCAA tournament. And even like you said, the conference tournament as well. The popularity in that has kind of faded away. Like you said, back in the day, one of my favorite sports moments is that Syracuse UConn, was it 6 overtime game that played in the Garden, and Cardiac Kemba winning 5 in a row, 4 or 5 in a row to win the Big East and then win the NCAA tournament like that. Those conference tournament moments, I feel like aren't as iconic or as relevant or as prevalent in today's sports world. So maybe that's part of it too. I think a big reason why the conference tournament has kind of faded away in some form of popularity is because you look at the requirements to make the NCAA tournament. You hear it all the time that the selection committee, they don't even take into account how someone does in the championship game. They kind of have their brackets set by Saturday or even late Friday because they got to figure out travel schedules. They got to make sure that the teams, because they have a rule, if you're in the same conference, you can't play in the first round, so they have to make sure matchups align. So you heard all the time that they're basically done on Saturday. They're not making selections at the 23rd hour on selection Sunday. They're actually done early. So I think that plays into it as well. But in terms of the sport of college basketball, and this is the other side, I wanted to take your question, Omar. I don't think that in terms of for the sport of college basketball, not for the fans, but for the sport, for the teams, the players, coaches, etc., I don't think that it's all about March Madness. That's all about the NCAA tournament because you still got to get to the NCAA tournament. So, and the Memphis Tigers, as you mentioned, the team that I cover, they're a great example of this. Throughout the whole year, people would say they could either make the Sweet 16 or they could lose in the first round of the AAC tournament. Well, breaking news, everybody, to make the Sweet 16, you have to make the NCAA tournament. And that, in order to make the NCAA tournament, you had to have performed well enough throughout the regular season to have a resume good enough to make the NCAA tournament. That obviously didn't happen. Their resume was nowhere near good enough, too many bad losses, and then they crap the bed in the AAC conference tournament and lose in the first round, second round, technically, their first game of the AAC tournament to take them completely off whatever bubble that they were even on in the first place. So for teams, it's still, I think that college basketball does a good balance of the importance of the regular season and the importance of March Madness. Because obviously March Madness is still important. Upsets happen all the time. Right. We saw tons of upsets so far, just the first 2 days of the NCAA tournament, as we always do. So obviously seeding still matters. You want to perform well in the regular season to get as best of a seed as possible. Yes, upsets do happen, but in terms of winning the whole NCAA tournament, the better seed usually wins. That's just a fact. So seeding still matters. The way you play in the regular season still matters. And I think college basketball does a really good job of balancing the importance of the regular season and March Madness.
So would you say then that, I kind of want to dial into the tournament. So obviously you mentioned the casual fan aspect, and that's kind of what I've fallen into recently. You know, so like during the college basketball regular season, I'm like, oh, okay, Texas is playing Kansas today, or I could watch some NBA. Generally, I've been leaning towards watching the NBA, and that's just my preference. You know, there's nothing that can be fixed with that. But with the tournament, obviously, everybody dials in. Like, I've been dialed into the first 2 days. Friends of mine who haven't watched any college basketball kind of really tuned up their calendar for it. So, from your perspective, as somebody who goes through the regular season, goes through the conference tournament, is watching the tournament, what makes this period, this March Madness period, so magical? In a piece that I am writing about this subject that's coming out today, I kind of theorized that, you know, it's obviously the upset potential, but it's also maybe the timing, right? It's kind of the dregs of the NBA and the NHL seasons where they get to the playoffs. NFL draft is still weeks away, you know, so it's kind of like a lull in the sports calendar, right? You know, baseball hasn't started yet, you know, that kind of thing. And so what do you think makes the tournament so magical for, you know, the average viewer that makes them lock in every single year, filling out a bracket, getting into pools, the whole nine?
Well, the timing aspect that you said, Omar, is something that I was actually going to bring up myself, because that's a phenomenal point. You think about not just in terms of the sports calendar, but just the global calendar. It's now spring for America. It's now spring. And you just come back from the gloominess and the cold. Everyone's indoors, and now the flowers are blooming again. The weather's getting better. The pollen's coming out, which is a horrible time for me. So I'm always so excited for this time, because you have the Masters, you have March Madness, you have baseball season starting up, NBA playoffs are right around the corner. So I always love this time of the year. But then my allergies remind me that I hate this time of the year at the same time. But I digress. Either way, you think about where we are in just the calendar of the year. It's now, things are getting brighter. Things are getting happier because it's spring. And now you have arguably the most magical sports tournament ever to exist. Arguably, you know, you could obviously argue other things, but arguably March Madness is the most magical sporting event ever. You add that to the timing of the actual calendar, and you get the perfect recipe for, as you state, the magic of March Madness. It's 100% the upset possibility. You know, it reminds me of just the beauty of sports in general, the David versus Goliath stories. Think about Leicester City winning the Premier League. You think about George Mason making a Final Four back in like late 2000s, if I remember correctly. And that's what you think about. You think about the underdog stories, and everyone loves an underdog story. Everybody.
Why do you think we love that so much, Francis? Like, what about it is like I'll give, like, we'll use the Kentucky OU example. I lived in Detroit. I know what OU is. It's a small school in the suburbs of Detroit. Okay. And here they are. They get these guys no one's ever heard of. This guy who was in D2 for 4 years, Golke hitting 10 threes, almost setting the record. So that's obviously exciting. But like, what about this David versus Goliath thing do you think appeals to us? Because I feel like it's not that same way in football. Like, a lot of times in the football playoff, Like I remember years ago, Hawaii made
Oh yeah,
a Fiesta Bowl or Sugar Bowl. What made a BCS Bowl, and they got smoked by a superior team from the SEC. And everyone's like, oh gosh, see, we wasted this bowl game on Hawaii. They don't have the talent, they don't have the athletes. But in basketball, we're all about it. Like if I like in my bracket this year, I had Samson beating Kansas, and they came really close, and we saw James Madison, win yesterday as well, and we loved that. Like if we had a couple of double-digit seeds in the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight, I think as a fan base we'd be super elated. So why do you think that is? Like, what about the March Madness David versus Goliath is something that we like versus maybe not as much in other sports?
So I think in college football, it's harder for upsets to happen.
Yeah,
because it's such a physical game, and when you put 11v11, and one side that has 11 players is the far superior group of athletes, physically imposing, it's harder. There's just more people, so it's just harder to have upsets happen. Now, obviously, they do happen in college football. Boise State beating Oklahoma in the Tostitos Fiesta Bowl back in, I don't remember the year off the top of my head. Yeah. I'm a Michigan fan. Appalachian State beating Michigan. Good Lord. I hate that I have to.
I even want to bring that up, Francis. You
I know.
Went there,
I did it myself.
I know it's a sore spot. Yeah.
Self-inflicted wounds. But so they happen in college football, but I think they're few and far between because of the physical difference between top tier league programs and the lower level programs in college football. Sure. College basketball, you see that more often in March Madness in college basketball because it's 5v5. The athletic difference between these teams isn't always that big. You saw Grand Canyon face St. Mary's, and this is not disrespect to St. Mary's, but that team isn't chock full of like elite, Zion Williamson type athletes. That's just not the type of basketball program that they have or the players that they have. So you have those athletic players who obviously are fantastic basketball players, but then you face a team like Grand Canyon, who does have their own athletes, but also just won their conference. I think they only had 3 losses throughout the entire year. Like that's a very good basketball team. And so you put them on a court, 5v5, anything really can happen because there's talent on both sides of the ball. So you hear like Jack Golke say after they beat Kentucky, he said that, at any given day, I can go on the court and beat these guys. Like, because I know he knows his talent. And all these guys have talent. And, if basketball's a make or miss sport. If one team, no matter the athleticism, no matter the height, speed, quickness, if one team is making shots, that team's probably going to win. Like, it's a make or miss sport. Like, it's just kind of how it goes. So that's probably what happens more in college basketball. And then to go to your other part of your question, why do we root for the underdogs? I think it's a bit of, I think we see a bit of ourselves in the underdog teams because, I'm not a part of the 1%. Omar, I know you're not a part of the 1%. So when you see underdogs rise up against the Goliaths, that's like, oh, wow. Like that kind of reminds me of my background and how I've gotten to where I am now. And I want to root for that because I see a bit of myself in them. And it's also like that American mentality where you kind of want to support the blue collar roughnecks or the types that aren't always favored or whatever. Even though America, that's a political conversation that I don't want to get into. But either way, I think it's a lot of combinations of different factors as to why we root for underdogs. But either way, it's such an addicting feeling to see underdogs win. Like when you see Oakland beat Kentucky, I'm like, screw my bracket. The hell with that. Like, I don't even care anymore. Like I want the upset. Like when Purdue lost last year, I was like, I had Purdue in my Final Four last year, and I didn't give a damn. I did not care that Purdue lost because that's amazing. That's so cool to see a 16 seed beat a 1. That's amazing. And it's such a rush. It's such an adrenaline rush and such an addicting feeling to have that I think that's also part of why we just love seeing upsets.
Real quick before we get to our next topic, of the upset teams that have kind of gone through the second round, do you have a favorite that you like monitoring maybe to make a Sweet 16 through the rest of the way here?
Well, I guess the easy answer is North Carolina State, just because they're about to face Oakland and they are an 11 seed facing a 14. That's probably the easy answer. But as we just talked about Cardiac Kemba earlier in the
Mhm.
show, winning 4 in a row or 5 in a row in the Big East
Mhm.
tournament, and then winning the whole damn thing. I don't think North Carolina State has a guy like Kemba Walker on their team, but they're on an absolute dream run
Mhm.
to go for, again. I'm sorry for forgetting 4-4 in the ACC tournament. It's either 4-4 or 5-5, but either way, an insane run in the ACC tournament, beating Virginia down by 6 with about like 20 seconds left, winning that game in overtime, then playing North Carolina, your in-state rival, where I'm sure that North Carolina State fans have always felt belittled by North
Yeah.
Carolina
Yeah.
fans, and then to beat them
100%.
to win the conference. Oh, come on. Like, that's amazing. And then to go to the NCAA tournament, win your first round matchup, which is, again, also amazing. And now you get to face a 14 seed, which obviously Oakland just beat Kentucky, so it's not going to be a walk in the park for them. But they got to be thinking, dang, we're about to be in the Sweet 16. Like, we have a real shot at this. And you make the Sweet 16, you already beat North Carolina, a 1 seed in this tournament. They got to think that they can beat anybody in the world right now. And that's a feeling that I hope they keep riding, because it would be one hell of a story.
Yeah, they got that big man who I think is going to give OU a lot of problems because
As
they
it,
just don't have the size to compete with that guy, you
yeah,
know. And yeah, he's a force down low, and there's a difference.
yeah,
You know, a lot of people say that guards win the tournament, but NC State is kind of giving you a little bit of an alternative flavor there, right? With
yeah.
relying so heavily on their big man. I want to kind of shift over, talk a little one and done. So obviously, a lot of people have opinions on one and done. You, as somebody who covers Memphis, you guys have had quite a few one and done players over the years. Obviously, Derrick Rose comes to mind, DeJuan Wagner,
Right.
recently James Wiseman, Tyreek Evans before him.
Yep.
So guys that had mixed success in the NBA. Obviously Derrick Rose became a superstar. DeJuan Wagner derailed by injuries, unfortunately, and James Wiseman looks like he might have been a miss. Maybe could have benefited from another year in college. Tyreek Evans, a fascinating career that should probably have a documentary made about him.
No
But,
question.
so I guess my ultimate question when it comes to one and done, you've seen it used to be where big college programs like Duke and Kansas would be like, well, we don't recruit that type of player. But now they do. They get the one and done player because those are the best players that you can get, even if you're only going to have them for a year. Obviously, we talked about Kentucky earlier. They've made a living off of one and done players. So do you kind of see that as a net negative with all the one and dones for like big college brands where, it's one player comes in, like you mentioned Zion Williamson. He's in 1 year, all right, gone the next year. You can only kind of stop for a cup of coffee in Durham before heading off to the NBA. So do you kind of see one and done as a little bit of a making it harder for college basketball big brands to really flourish?
So let me let me make sure I understand the question correctly. When you say flourish, do you mean like keep their popularity at a high? Is that what you mean?
Right. So like think about like I'll go way back before both of our times in the 80s, right? When Georgetown was coached by John Thompson.
Of
You
course.
had Patrick Ewing for multiple years. You had Alonzo Mourning, Dikembe Mutombo, Allen Iverson for multiple years. And they developed an identity and a brand based off of that. Like the whole Hoya paranoia thing, that doesn't happen if Patrick Ewing's a one and done, right?
Right.
Whereas now it feels like the players are like Lego pieces that are being interchanged out, and you're just kind of mostly relying on the cachet of the coach when it comes to like the reputation of a program. So like you cover the Grizzlies, obviously John Morant put Murray State on the map for a couple years and then went to the NBA. Murray
Yeah.
State, we haven't heard from him since, and it's just like,
Right.
what is that kind of good for the game of college basketball? Like, obviously, guys want to go to the NBA, make their money. No one has a problem with that. But in the context of the health of the game of basketball in college, do you think that that's kind of a bad thing?
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, for the health of college basketball, I don't think it's a good thing, because what made college basketball, I think, at its peak popularity was you would see the JJ Redicks, you would see the Tyler Hansboroughs, you'd see the type of players
Right.
who would stay at their colleges 3-4 years and make an absolute brand for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And you could also, you didn't always have to learn new players on a constant basis. Like you knew who's going to be on the roster the next year. You could buy their jersey and be like, okay, that's who I'm going to support for the next 3-4 years of my life. And then when they go to the pros, I'll support them then. But you build that bond and connection with those type of players who stay at colleges for an extended amount of time. That's why I think college football is still at its peak of popularity, because you can draw these attachments to these college guys. Like I'm gonna ride for JJ McCarthy for the rest of my life. I'm gonna ride for Blake Corum the rest of my life because I watched them play in Michigan for 3 years. Blake Corum for 4 years. Like I've been able to grow a bond with them. Obviously, they don't know me, but like I've been able to build some connection with them.
An attachment,
exactly, an attachment. Thank you. And that's harder to do, very hard to do in college basketball because of the one and done rule. And I know later on the show we're going to talk about the transfer portal. It's the same thing. It's a similar concept that I'll elaborate on later. But yeah, I definitely think it does harm college basketball. I don't think there's any clear way to fix it. We're going to talk about NIL in a bit. I think that helps because it's incentivizing more players to stay in college, to play an extra year, to make a little bit more money than were they to go to the G League or were they to go overseas or what have you. They can stay in college in a more, let's be real, fun environment than go playing in a country in Europe. So they can stay in college and make good money off of their name, image, and likeness. So that helps, but I don't think it solves the issue. The only thing that would solve it is if the NBA took out the one and done rule. Like if they just straight up made like college football, made a 3-year requirement, just like college football. That's the only way. Otherwise, NIL is like a band-aid to an overall bigger problem that college basketball has to figure out a way to fix.
The abolishing of the one and done rule, most people say, "Oh, just let them come in from high school again," like they did, in the Kobe and Garnett era.
Right.
But your point about make it 2 years, I think could eventually benefit the development of athletes. Like you look at these guys who are coming in and they're so raw, and a lot of times a lot of these guys, they're on their second or third teams by the time they're actually developing into something, because they had advisors and people telling them, hey, you got to get this contract, you got your draft stock, you're a lottery pick, go ahead and get it. And there's a lot of cautionary tales there, of guys who jumped in too early. By the time they're 22, they're out of the league. Their second contract never got renewed, and it's a lot of swings and misses. You're betting a lot on upside, and again, hate to kind of throw him under the bus again, but it's kind of like James Wiseman, a guy who probably could have benefited from another year in college, and you could argue Golden State had no business taking him as a team that was still competing for championships. And he's a guy who I follow because I remember I'm being really high on him in the draft. And like you said, you grow attachment to a player, right? And, he's struggling in Detroit. He's struggled in Golden State. And, you just can't help but wonder, man, if you stayed another year, even 2 years at Memphis, what would have happened, for your draft stock? Would you have still been a top 2 or 3 pick? Probably, because of the athletics, so the athletic measurements there. But, that's kind of like the untold thing that people don't really talk about that much when it comes to these one and done stuff. They're like, oh, make your money. But maybe it could have been a situation where here's a guy who ends up with a 5-year career in the NBA. Could have been a 10-year career if he had a little bit more polish. So you mentioned NIL, so that is a great segue by you, into the next thing we're going to talk about. So obviously name, image, likeness, we've seen it everywhere. College athletes are doing commercials. On the women's side, Caitlin Clark is in a bunch of commercials now. She's getting her money, and she's established a brand for herself, as she is going to be more than likely the number 1 overall pick in the WNBA draft this coming season. But do you think that obviously the benefits are there, right? We're paying the players. They're getting money for making these universities so much money. I look at using the John Moran example. I don't even he must have made so much money in admissions and interest for Murray State, a college that most people don't even know where it's at or what conference they play in, to get them on the map and get people interested in going there because he's John Morant. He's an NBA superstar and he went here, right? So it's great to see players finally getting compensated for that. I guess what are some unforeseen circumstances or some drawbacks of this NIL system as currently instituted in college athletics?
From my perspective, the drawbacks actually aren't really unforeseen. Omar,
Okay.
I think these are the drawbacks that the naysayers against NIL from the jump that 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 have happened. Honestly, it's created an arms race across college sports that those who are against NIL completely expected. And the other thing is, I don't think NIL actually changes the hierarchy of college athletics. I think it's always still going to be the teams with the most money are going to be the most successful. And now it's legal to have players make money. When it wasn't legal, look, I nothing anyone could tell me could convince me that there wasn't money being given out, even on the back
No, there's
back
evidence.
deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no chance. And the reason why is because they had the most money already. They had the highest paying boosters. They had the highest grossing colleges, universities, etc. There's nothing you can tell me that there wasn't money already being given on the back door, and that was because they had the money. And now they can just get it more in a more legal basis. Now there's still teams who do things illegally and give money illegally. That still happens. Teams have violated the NIL rules already. There's investigations already. But I think anyone who thought that, oh, now it's just going to be richest team is going to be the most successful. Yes, it is. That's literally how it's going to be. The team with the biggest pockets are going to get the best players out of the transfer portal, are going to get the best players coming out of high school. That's just that simple. If you're a 5-star recruit coming out of high school and I'm playing college football, I go to Alabama because they're going to offer me like an NIL package that's worth like $7 million or whatever. Like, yeah, I'm going to take that over going to play for Memphis, who might offer me like $1 million NIL package. Of course, I'm going to go to Alabama, take $7 million. Of course.
Right.
Like, I don't know off the top of my head, but I feel like I remember reading, and you might know, Omar, how much Caleb Williams made last year in NIL.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember off the top of your head?
I think it was over 10 million.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking, and that's my point, because it's USC. It's freaking USC, one of the biggest college programs in the country.
Yeah.
It's USC, and it's Caleb Williams. Like, this is one of the most coveted guys out of the transfer portal, and now going to be the top pick in this year's NFL draft because he's Caleb Williams. So that's my point. Like, the drawbacks of NIL, I just don't think are really unforeseen. It's just what everyone predicted, and now they're real. And it's a matter of balancing the drawbacks with the benefits that you mentioned earlier, Omar, because the benefits, in my opinion, do outweigh the drawbacks, because the benefits of NIL are exactly like what you said. Caitlin Clark, I love that women's college basketball is becoming more popular. I love that. But let's be real. You go back 10 years ago, then it would have been, there's no way she could have made that money. And now she can make that money because of NIL. And that's amazing that Caitlin Clark can do that. Angel Reese can do that, because they should be able to. They should have always been able to. If Candace Parker were playing in the NIL days, she would be making so mush money, and she would have deserved every penny of that money. And now, these athletes can do so. You can see even golfers can hold a coaching clinic and make money from their name, image, and likeness. You can see, just a lacrosse player could, be a spokesperson of a sporting goods store or what have you, or somebody who plays for a D2 college with a really cool name can get a sponsorship with a company that has a similar name, stuff like that. That's awesome. That's what NIL is about. Even Jack Golke, the guy we were talking about before, he just got a TurboTax sponsorship like last night, and he filmed a commercial in the ballroom of his hotel talking about TurboTax. Like that. That's awesome. That's really cool that they can do that, because they should have always been able to do that. It was such a caveman type system that the NCAA was operating under, and thankfully they've made it to the 21st century. And obviously NIL is not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And for me, the benefits definitely outweigh any drawbacks that exist.
You kind of mentioned the whole highest bidder thing, and that kind of I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's going to be more like the NFL, where the Jaguars could make a run to the conference championship by having a lot more parity in the league. I think the reality is it's more like European soccer, where you have, I'll use the French league as an example. Not a lot of people follow it. I do, but where Paris Saint-Germain is the preeminent money maker in that league, and not a surprise. They're always in the top three. Generally they win the league every year. Whereas like a club like, Monaco or Marseille, they're kind of on a lower level. They just can't compete with the type of talent that PSG brings in. And I think you're seeing that. You use the Pac-12 USC thing. USC is going to get Oregon. They're going to be able to get players that Stanford and Oregon State are not. It's it's who went there. It's the haves and the have-nots. And that's kind of the reality. You touched on transfer portal a little bit, and obviously it's kind of been a thing. It's almost become a little bit of a joke where like somebody has a slightly bad game and they want to enter the transfer portal, right? And you see it in basketball, you see it in football as well. I feel as somebody looking at both sports, it's maybe a little bit more pronounced in football, but you still get it a lot in the way that rosters are built in basketball. I mentioned St. John's earlier. Rick Pitino came in and hit the transfer portal immediately. And that seems to be the formula now, whereas it used to be, hey, we're going to go after these recruits, blah, blah, blah. But now it's kind of like, yeah, we'll go after the recruits, but also we're going to hit the transfer portal real hard. So do you think that the way that a lot of people have advocated for a little bit more regulation around that, almost like a cap on how much transferring can be done? You've seen some of the horror stories in football, especially where I think a guy who was a quarterback at Miami, like ended up transferring to like 4 or 5 different schools throughout his college career. His career was over. And this is a guy who was a 5-star recruit who had NFL aspirations, but he kept on switching. And it kind of was to the detriment of his career. Do you think that there should be a little bit more guidelines and restrictions around the transfer portal in today's college athletics?
I think there should be something. I don't know what that should be. I don't know what specific restrictions or guidelines need to be in place. But I do think it's just a little bit. It seems a little too easy for players to leave. It's not even like free agency in NFL or NBA or whatever, because they have a set contract. When that contract is up, then they're a free agent. But in college, it's nothing like that at all. You're not signing
mercenaries, right? 1-year deals.
Exactly. You're basically, but you're not even a mercenary. You're like with the age of the transfer portal, you see people transferring, midway through the year because they're not getting playing time or what have you. So it's like you're kind of like an at-will person, but even worse, like even like more, you can leave whenever you want to, like literally anytime. So I think it's something along the lines of at least forcing a player to stay at a school for 2 years, or hell, even forcing them to stay 1 full year at the very least, like putting that set in stone, I think would be a step in the right direction. Because otherwise it just seems a little bit too easy for players to enter the transfer portal. Again, it's not like free agency in the NBA or the NFL where you have a 2-year deal. At the end of the 2 years, you're a free agent. You don't have that in college. You're kind of a free agent the moment you sign a letter of intent. Like I think we just saw an offensive tackle from Alabama transfer to Iowa, and then like a couple of weeks later transfer back to Alabama. And like that seems too easy. Like if you transfer from Alabama to Iowa, there has to be something that locks you into that deal. You know what I'm saying? There has to be something. Now, does that lead to drafting a contract and then a collective bargaining agreement and then player unions? Yes, because correct. It does. It opens the door to like, it almost like a Pandora's box of labor law that you have to get into and properly abide by. But that's not a bad thing. Like it's just proper things in place to ensure a fair transfer player. So I don't think that's necessarily bad. But as you said before, it's like it feels like hiring mercenaries. And a point that I wanted to bring up before when we were talking about the one and done rule. One of my favorite college coaches of all time is Jay Wright. I absolutely adore Jay Wright as a college basketball coach. He built a fantastic program at Villanova, as we all know, national championship winner, et cetera, et cetera. I remember reading an article about Jay Wright that outlined his recruiting philosophy for players. Because Villanova wasn't known to go for the 5 stars and sign a bunch of them just like a Duke or a Kentucky or what have you. He was not the type of guy. He didn't target one and dones either. He had 4-year plans for high school recruits, that he would go to high school gyms, go into the homes of these high school players, and lay out a clear-cut 4-year plan that he had for these players. We know what you are. In 4 years, this is what you will be, and this will get you to the NBA, to play in Spain or China or whatever you want to do with the rest of your career. But like, this is the type of player we know you can be, and we have this plan for you. In this age of the transfer portal, that is literally a pipe dream. To do that for a college program, that's not a thing, dude. That's not a real thing. Because like you said, Rick Pitino, Penny Hardaway, for that matter as well, they love transfer portal guys because they have college basketball experience under their belt. They're not fresh faces coming out of high school who have no idea what a college basketball defense looks like or anything like that. They prioritize the transfer portal guys because they have experience, because they've been there. They've played in the big games. They played in March Madness. They want guys who know to a degree what they're doing. And high schoolers, they don't. Like, most of them don't. It takes a long time for high schoolers to get adjusted to college basketball. Even if you're like the elite high school prospect. You look at Harrison Ingram coming out of high school, 5-star player coming out of high school, goes to Stanford, has not a good year at Stanford, doesn't have a good year, transfers to North Carolina, and he's been okay. He's been good. But he hasn't been the 5-star, oh my God, top 5 prospect that everyone thought he would be coming out of high school, because it's hard. Adapting to college basketball is very difficult for anybody, for everybody. And now you look at the day and age of transfer portal, you'd rather get the 3rd-year guy who's entering his senior year, who you maybe hope and pray has a 5th year of eligibility, but really you're getting a 1-year rental because he's experienced, he's been there, and he's talented. Like, teams are prioritizing that type of player than getting a 5-star out of high school, really. Like, they'd rather go get a transfer from North Carolina, Michigan, Duke, Kentucky, wherever. They'd rather get that guy because they know what they're doing. They know what it's like to play in college basketball. And it's created kind of that problem we talked about before with the brand in college programs. It's hard to gain attachments to players. As a Tiger person, I love Kendrick Davis. Like, I wish he stayed at Memphis. I wish he was always a Memphis Tiger because he's a hell of a player. But we only got him for a year, and it's just one of those things that I don't think, unless you created limitations on the transfer portal and something like I said, like you transfer to a team, you have to stay there for a year, or you can't. It's way too easy to just move at all willy-nilly. It's way too easy. So something has to be in place.
Yeah, you kind of brought up the Villanova thing, and it's ironic because like now you see that a lot of these Villanova guys have had success in the NBA as 3 or 4 year players: Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo, Jalen Brunson, Mikal Bridges. Yep. Even Eric Paschal had a little bit of success with Golden State before. I think he's in Europe now, but it's an interesting dynamic, when it comes to that. And I've always kind of wondered if like we're kind of heading towards the establishment of a super league that is more of a professional thing that license out the brand image and likeness of a school. So using Memphis as an example, like let's say they become affiliated with the Grizzlies and they're kind of like their amateur outlet, right? And then that, the Grizzlies are using the Tigers kind of brand name. You say the same thing with like the Hornets and Duke, right? And stuff like that. So to that point, we've seen a lot of realignment in college sports. It's mostly been with football in mind because football is the moneymaker. I would argue in terms of interest in sports, it goes NFL, then college football, then maybe NBA, maybe college basketball after that, right? And then you've got like baseball, MLS, hockey, all those other sports. So college football could be argued as the second most popular sport in the U.S. And so you've seen a lot of realignment there. The Pac-12 now doesn't exist because of all the schools there going either to the Big 12, SEC, to the Big 10, whatever. And we've seen, other kind of conference shuffling. The team you cover in Memphis has been a part of a lot of conference realignment over the years. Obviously, in the Missouri Valley Conference for a little bit, in Conference USA for a bit, and now in the American Athletic Conference, and So they've kind of jumped around a lot with these conferences. So, and as somebody who mentioned earlier, grew up on the Big East, even like people like yourself watching Michigan grew up on Big Ten football. Now, the Big Ten is goes from Washington to New Jersey. It's
Right.
just like it covers the entire country. So do you think that it's kind of, while it's benefited football, do you think that this kind of realignment has kind of hurt the whole overall proposition of college basketball by taking away the regional aspect of it, right? It's a much more national situation as opposed to like pockets of different regions.
I don't think it'll hurt college basketball. It's just a change that people will just have to get used to. I think, I think what was so sad about the realignment from the Big East is you lost some of those rivalries
Right.
that you had back in the day. But then that just opens the door for new rivalries to occur. And speaking from a Memphis perspective, when Houston was in the American Athletic with Memphis, that was one of the best rivalries in college basketball, Memphis and Houston. And now Houston's gone to the Big 12. And now Memphis has a rivalry with FAU. Like, that's now a new rivalry as to what's going to happen next season and so on and so forth. So it sucks to see rivalries die, or that die might be too strong for it, be postponed for a period of time. But that just opens the door for a new rivalry, for a new connection to another school and a new proposition. So I don't think it hurts college basketball. It's just something that fans will have to get used to. And then you look at the potential for, again, talk about Houston. They dominated the American Athletic, one of the best teams in that conference. Memphis obviously was a close second place, but Houston was the best team in that conference for a while. Mm-hmm. They go to the Big 12 and they dominate the Big 12. Like, they were the best team in the Big 12. They lose the Big 12 conference tournament, but they're one of the best teams in Big 12. And that's not a football school. That's a basketball school going to that very heavy basketball program, or a conference, in the Big 12, and just dominating. Not the transition from an American Athletic Conference to the Big 12 was seamless. Because they're just a damn good program led by one of the best coaches in college basketball. So I don't think it necessarily hurts basketball. It's just something new that fans will have to get adjusted to. I also think it gives these programs new challenges, because sometimes you play certain teams so many times, you kind of get used to their style. But now, teams have to adapt a little bit. Teams will have to get used to a different type of basketball, different type of opponent. And I think that's exciting. I think it should be really exciting. Now, to your point about it feels kind of like a super league, I think I even think in college football, we're going to get to that much sooner than people think in terms of the college football playoff even. Like, I think there's rumors that the Big
You really
Ten
only got like 5 schools that are on the outside looking in. You got the couple of ACC schools with Clemson, Florida State, and then the Big 12. You got a couple of like mid-level kind of sometimes are interesting schools in the context of football. So I agree with you. I think it's incredibly close, to becoming a reality in football.
Yeah, I think it really is. And can that harm college basketball? Putting more of the emphasis on college football, perhaps. But I think it's also just the reality of the college sport landscape that we live in. Like you said, college football is the moneymaker. College football is actually more important in terms of conference realignment than college basketball as a whole. Look at, again, Houston's like, I guess, the outlier in that regard. But Memphis is begging to get out of the American because of to join a high profile conference. And I understand the argument that people say that in order to be the most appealing to a different conference, it's really going to have to be the football program. And I get that. That's why next season will be really important for the Tigers, and hopefully they can make it to the college football playoff, make some noise, and that'll boost their status. But to conclude my overall point, I don't think it'll hurt college basketball. It's just a new reality that fans will have to get used to. And it could also be a good recruiting pitch, because you're talking to high schoolers, you're talking to transfer portal guys, and say, hey, now you come to my school, you're now going to be playing the big dogs of the top of college programs. And I think that could also benefit college basketball as well, because you attract more talent, facing better teams. So I just think it's something that people will have to get used to.
On the Memphis front, I guess we would close on this. Would you kind of see them trying to angle into the SEC? Obviously, you create a natural rivalry with Tennessee there, with Knoxville and Memphis kind of being in close proximity. Or do you see them perhaps going to the Big 12 for an eventual plan to go to the SEC because maybe they're not high profile enough to get into the SEC straight from the American, but maybe they do, the Cincinnati and BYU route of going to the Big 12, and maybe eventually getting into a bigger conference. So what do you think their path is to, a higher profile conference?
Well, I think the dream for Memphis people is the Big 12. Would be the SEC, but I think the easiest path would be to get to the Big 12 at the moment. They've already been in talks with the Big 12 conference in the past, and unfortunately for Memphis, they got passed over in the most recent conference realignment cycle. But it's going to happen again. The conference realignment is not going to go away. Teams are going to leave conferences and join conference. It's not going to stop. So as long as Memphis can keep, they're going to have a brand new football stadium in the next couple of years, and so that'll help change things for the football program. As long as Penny Hardaway stays the coach of Memphis and continues to improve as a coach, and that program continues to be on the up and up, then I think when we look at conference realignment, it'll be hard to pass up Memphis in the conference alignment cycle. I mean, I hope that's the case. Obviously, I'm not plugged into the insiders of conference realignment, but I think that would be the best scenario for Memphis to get into the Big 12. I know when the Pac-12 was trying to figure out what was going to happen with that conference, they've been talking about trying to have Memphis join the new look Pac-12. That could be intriguing because if the Big 12 doesn't open the doors to Memphis, you still find a way to get into a Power 5 conference, even whether or not the Pac-12 retains the Power 5 conference status is a different story. But that would still be a step up. I just think from the Memphis Tigers perspective, they just want to get out of the American Athletic Conference. Like they want to get to a bigger name conference because it's just different money. Like it's just different. It's just different revenue for teams in bigger conference than smaller ones.
If they join the Big 12, obviously football is king with all of these considerations, but that kind of becomes one hell of a basketball conference, man. You look like BYU just made the tournament as a 6th seed. Baylor, Cincinnati's always like Houston. You mentioned is a national powerhouse. Iowa State is a great basketball program. Kansas State, all these. West Virginia's had success as well. A lot of really strong basketball schools. Kansas, of course. They're
Kansas,
one of the blue bloods. Again, Arizona as well. So that becomes one hell of a basketball conference. And you add Memphis to that, it becomes incredibly intriguing. But we have gone super long on this one. Obviously, a great conversation, Francis. I did not mention at the top that you are with Bluff City Media. I think I just mentioned that you covered the Tigers. But I want to just let everybody know where they can follow your excellent work covering all things Memphis sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, Omar. Yeah, you all can find me on Twitter. I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter, quite frankly. Find me on Twitter at Slugga Sports, SLUGGA Sports. I write for Bluff City Media. I'm trying to do an article talking about that Memphis Tigers season and what are proper expectations for the Memphis Tigers program entering next year and for the future in general. So I'm working on that, hopefully get that out soon. And also I do Tigers Live. So every time Tigers basketball play a game, I host a live show right as soon as the buzzer goes off. We go live in our post-game show. So next season when Tigers basketball starts up, I'll be back hosting Tigers Live. It was an absolute blast doing that show with amazing people. So yeah, you can find me there. That show live streams on YouTube, on Twitter. I think Facebook maybe too. I think maybe not, but yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. Find me on Instagram, Francis Carlota. It's just my first name, last name. And yeah, Omar, thank you so much for having me on, dude. You're the man. Like I really, really respect the hell out of you. You're a fantastic guy, and you're an amazing writer. I seriously, that from the bottom of my heart, you're the man. I really respect you a lot, and I appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, that is incredibly high praise, Francis. I just string some words together and hope it sticks, So, but like Francis mentioned, you can follow him on X/Twitter at Slugga Sports. A lot of great commentary about Memphis and other sports in general as well. Great conversation here. Make sure to like and subscribe on the podcast. You can catch us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, you could subscribe to Substack at deepcover.substack.com. Francis, thanks again, man. It was a blast talking hoops with you, and we'll have to bring you on again in the future to talk about some other Memphis stuff. Maybe, we could talk about the Grizzlies heading into next season when, the whole team isn't injured. So
that's right.
but all right, Francis, thanks so much for jumping on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for another episode of Deep Cover Podcast, and we will catch you next week.